but I just love the CK. But so great to be here tonight again and to be amongst who I believe are our friends, our future. So it's an honor for me.
Well, CK, you already dived right in. No one came to hear me. So we wanted to get to know you. That's the point of the program, to get to know our Board of Governor members. And so we do have some recent law students, now graduates. I know I saw past chair Kevin Jones on the line. So President Hoffler, can you tell us about your background and what made you apply to law school?
Certainly. Well, my background, I've had a little bit of an unusual background. It's great, but it's unusual. It's unconventional for Americans and certainly for African Americans. I grew up in Geneva, Switzerland, at least from grades 1 to grade 8. I went to boarding school. There were 5 of us in my family, 3 of us sisters. I was the youngest of the 3. And I really went to boarding school from the age of 6. Oh, wow. And in the same school, I had my sister who was 2 years older than me, and then my older sister who was 2 years older than her. And then my aunt was also in the same school. And my cousin was at a college, American college, in Les Uns, which was not too far, maybe 2 hours away from the school that we were at. So it was an international school. They had day students and they had a pretty extensive boarding school. And we were, I think, the 3rd African-American family there.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Most of the Black students were either from the Caribbean or from Africa, different African countries. And even though, I mean, I don't know if my age is a secret, but if I've been in practice for 33 years, so we are talking about the late 60s, 1968, and I was there in school until 1976. So when I think about why I went to law school, I have recollections early on of, Switzerland is a country that I do love a lot. But if you think about Switzerland in the 60s, in Europe in the 60s, they did not have a lot of history or a tradition of seeing Black people or people of color. You have to remember that in the 40s, around the period of World War II, if you think of the Olympics, Hitler had convinced people in Europe that Black people had tails, that we were like monkeys. I mean, it's unbelievable that this is part of my history as a African-American woman, but I recall when I was 6 years old, walking in the woods with a group of, again, it was an international school, a group of students, and my sisters, my 2 older sisters were with us. Maybe there were about 10 or 11 of us, but people from all over the world. And as we were walking in the woods, I remember seeing a little girl who was in a stroller with her mom, and her pointing at us and saying, "Mommy, look at the little monkeys." I mean, that's a true story. So when I think of fast forward maybe 15 or so years, and I had really a magnificent experience in Switzerland. It was really all that I knew. That's where I developed my language skills. I was probably, by the time I was 7, fluent in French, because when you're younger, you pick up all these languages.
Right.
And I learned Spanish from French, so I became fluent in Spanish too, probably by the time I was 8 or 9. And then that kind of began my journey. We would come back home to the US, and I'm originally from Buffalo, New York, for holidays. And this was really, all of the students did the same thing. I was the youngest student, but my parents didn't want to separate the girls. There were 5 of us at the time, 3 of us sisters, and then my aunt, who basically took care of us. I remember things such as we straightened our hair, because the first year we didn't have perms. So we had this thick hair. Imagine 3 girls and my aunt, she was older, and she was straightening our hair. They thought we were burning down the villas because of the smell of, back in the day when you're straightening your hair, you had that thick hair grease that you put on. Anyway, after a while, we got perms. I think my first perm I got when I was 7, because there were no Black beauticians in Geneva, Switzerland. And we were at a little town outside of Geneva. And even though we were in an international school, the things that we may take for granted today did not exist in the late 60s. So you fast forward, I was there until grade 8, from grade 1 to grade 8. I went to high school, grades 9 to 13 in Toronto, Canada, because I was from Buffalo. So that was really only an hour and a half away from my family. But I was still in boarding school. I went to a Scottish school, a Scottish girls' school. So the school in Switzerland was a co-ed school. The school in Canada was a Scottish school called Branksome Hall Girls' School. We had a brother school too. I was at Branksome Hall until I graduated from grade 13. I accelerated, so I finished grade 9 to 13 in 4 years versus the 5-year course. And one of my guidance counselors had gone to Smith College. And the question came up, where should I go to college? So because I had grown up in Switzerland, when I looked at colleges and tried to decide where I should go to college, I wanted to do an exchange program. I knew my junior year was going to be a junior year abroad. And I looked at schools that had programs in Geneva, Switzerland, and Smith College did. Because I had gone to co-ed schools and single-sex schools, it really didn't bother me at the time. Well, it wasn't a big deal for me to be at a women's college. And so because my guidance counselor, who was Canadian, had gone to Smith College, she put this full court press. Smith was pursuing me aggressively. I visited a number of schools, but ultimately decided once I visited Smith College's campus that I wanted to go to college there. And you know, it's so interesting. You have to think of what it's like. I was 17 at the time. I had been one of, in most of my academic career at that point, one of maybe 5, 6, at best 10 Black students. When I was in school in Switzerland, it was an international school as well. So we had maybe a few more Black students. And I'm talking from junior kindergarten up to grade 13, multiple school systems, the French system, the Swiss system, British system, and the American system. There probably were, I don't know, 15, 20 students, both male and female. 3 of them were from my family. At the beginning, 4 of them were from my family. And what you saw were families would come together. So when I went to school in Toronto at Branksome Hall, my sister was there, so that was 2. There was a student from Liberia, a student from the Bahamas, and we were all best friends. But maybe 5 Black students from junior kindergarten to grade 13.
Wow.
And I was head girl. So head girl was like being the school president, but it also was something where academically you had to be you had to be on strong footing academically because the head mistress would actually appoint finally who the head girl was going to be, but it was also based on popularity, as any president of a school was. And it was a Scottish school, so I wore a kilt, as in a kilt, for 4 years. A green kilt, green socks, green blazer, and a tie to match the kilt. And when I'm talking about kilt, I mean a real kilt. And Oxfords and bloomers, as in bloomers, green bloomers. So we looked a hot mess. We couldn't wear any makeup. We could wear post earrings. But I can tell you, it was really a great experience in this sense. It was also an international school. In Canada, so there was more synergy and more familiarity in Canada with the US ways. I was close to home, so on the weekends, usually I went home and I took my girlfriend Bindu from Liberia, my girlfriend Margaret from the Bahamas, and we would go home to my home on the weekends. But it was a great experience because it was there where I really felt that the sky was the limit, where just based on my journey at that school in Canada, I really realized that there was no limitations to what I could do. My parents had always pushed us. But when you're in boarding school, the boarding school kind of takes over where your parents leave off. And many people in today's environment don't send their kids to boarding school. But when I was coming up, obviously my entire educational experience was spent in a boarding school. So that makes it different. But I was really fundamentally kind of the same little girl, young girl, that I have evolved into as a woman. So what made me want to go to law school? When I was in 10th grade, I started working at a law firm in the summers. I always had like 3 or 4 jobs. I always worked for my mom. She had a jewelry store. And so, we all had to work for my mom. But I thought, let's see, maybe I'd be a doctor, lawyer, or business person. So in my family, we had business people. My older brother was a lawyer, so I knew a little bit about law. He did criminal defense, what I know now is criminal defense work, but there were many years between us. So he was the oldest child and I was the youngest child. And so there were many, many years between us. And I just remember he was a lawyer. But I worked over the summer at law firms. And what I realized was I wanted to represent people. I felt that there were so many people that had no voice, had no say. And I had family members, quite frankly. Some were educated, some were not educated. I'm not saying we're well educated. We're not educated at all. I had family members that dropped out of high school, had to work to help to make a living. One I could think of who dropped out in 3rd grade, and just so many people in my life sacrificed ultimately so that I could get the quality of the education that I was afforded to have. And I learned early on that there are a whole bunch of educated fools. I shouldn't probably say that, but I say that there are people who have great education but don't have the common sense of those family members of mine who never went to college. And I remember I had a great uncle. He used to make up words and everything. He never had really a formal education beyond 12th grade. And in Buffalo years ago, Buffalo was a blue collar town and a lot of people worked for the plants, and it's a union town. And so they made a really good living doing that. And I remember when we would come back from school from Switzerland, and when you're in a foreign environment in an international school and you come back, you don't really sound like everybody else. Right. I mean, you really don't. You don't really interact the same way. So when we left, we were one way. When we came back, we were another way, speaking all these different languages. And I remember, at some point in high school, I was talking to my great uncle who was making up words every day. And I said something. He said, "Look, don't go using those big words on me. Don't think that just because you have all of this education that somehow that puts you in a different class, because you always have to remember your roots." And I remember that because I come from a tradition of people who just worked hard, just bottom line. They worked hard, they did well, they were blessed to push us and push me. I was the baby at that point. I come from a blended family, so now I had a brother and a sister. So I had many siblings, many siblings. And then I have family members who were raised with me who were like my siblings. So I come from a very big family. I come from an extended family, and there was never a question for me that I was going to excel and achieve, because I don't think I even had options. It was just the expectation. And I think when people sacrifice for you and give you all these experiences where you're like at 8 speaking all these languages and excelling at all this, I mean, you have to work hard. I mean, you don't have to, but I felt that I had to work hard. Right. And I didn't have a choice. And so that exposure that I had working at those law firms, it just really ignited in me the feeling that I should help people. I had family members that are not so different from many of the people that I represent today. And I'm able to really identify, relate, and understand, because that's my great uncle. That's that woman who took care of me. That's my great aunt. That's a cousin. That's a make-believe aunt and uncle. Right. And this is with all of this international background I had, that was really at the core and the foundation, the heart of who I am. So after going to Smith, I accelerated to Smith too. I graduated a semester early, did my honors thesis in French. I knew that whatever I did, it had to have some international flavor. Right. And when I thought of law schools that I should apply to, I wanted a law school that had probably a strong international curriculum. And I thought about DC, because when I was making a decision to go to law school, I didn't envision that I would practice law. I envisioned that I would be a diplomat. Because if you think about it, my background had been international. Already, even in college, I went back to University of Geneva. I did a year abroad. I wrote my honors thesis I did a comparative study. This is when I was really I want to say a deep thinker, but I I focused on the negritude movement and did a comparative analysis between that and the Harlem Renaissance. And I
Oh,
became
wow.
scholarly on magnificent scholars such as Franz
Is
Fanon.
that still available?
It is somewhere. I think I have a copy,
Okay.
but people like Aimé Césaire, Franz Fanon were, you know, French Francophone scholars that helped to shape my orientation from a political standpoint. I remember a book, it's still a classic, called The Wretched of the Earth. It's a book that I would commend for those of you who want to really understand what's going on now. You know, there's a whole history of decolonization that we know that African countries went through, and some countries in the Caribbean. And so Franz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, and others wrote books about that. And so when we think of the civil rights movement here in the United States, there were parallels with what was going on during decolonization in the diaspora. So at the time coming out of college, I was heavily engaged in that type of thinking and wanting to be a diplomat. And so Georgetown had a great international program. And then I remember I hadn't been to schools that had a lot of African Americans. So when I went to DC, oh my goodness, I got to DC. I was like, yes, I was like, hallelujah, oh my goodness. And then I went to Georgetown. There were 2,800 students at Georgetown. And when I was there were just what I thought were gobs of Black people. Now, and more than I had ever seen in an academic institution. So I was elated, delighted, excited about being in DC, which we called at that point Chocolate City. And it was during the days of Marion Barry. So there were a lot of colorful moments in DC. I loved it. We were protesting against apartheid. We were risking, just how people are protesting now, we were protesting and doing all that. Power to the people, because Nelson Mandela was in jail and the apartheid regime was alive and well. And really, I saw firsthand how nonviolent protests in another country can have an impact on bringing down an establishment. You know, Randall Robinson, Jesse Jackson, and people like that were at the forefront of that movement. And then in 1988, as a young associate, I was in the international department of a big firm. And that firm, one of the senior partners was African-American, and he represented different African governments. And so I had clerked at that firm from law school and throughout law school. And that's when I learned and discovered that I could practice as a lawyer and have an international career. And that's why I began practicing law, because I had worked at the World Bank for part of my summer after my second year. And I thought, yep, that's my road to being a diplomat, working at the World Bank, at the IMF, at the UN. And I realized after working that summer that I really didn't want to be what I now know as like a staff attorney, although the environment was just infinitely just exciting. You know, people from all over the world. Remember, I had that background. I was excited. Right. It's different if you're an American versus if you're a foreign national. But I was very excited about that journey. But I realized as a lawyer, I didn't want to be a lawyer to an economist or to an economic group. Right. And even though I worked in, at that point, they had divided in East and West Africa departments of the legal department. And that was great. And I worked on some exciting studies. I realized that I probably didn't want that as a career in terms of working at the World Bank or the IMF in the legal department. But all my professors in law school told me, you should be a trial lawyer. And I said, no, I don't want to be a trial lawyer, because I perceived that was like writing briefs. I said, I want to be an international lawyer. I want to travel the world. I want to go back to these countries. And I had the blessing of working for a big firm that had a robust international practice. And I worked under a law partner who did a lot of work in Africa. And it's such a small world. My close friend from Liberia, when I was in school in Canada, Bendu Dennis, who's still one of my best friends, her father was the late Cecil Dennis. He had been the equivalent of Secretary of State, Minister of Foreign Affairs for Liberia.
Wow.
And in my final year, grade 13, I remember I was head girl. I remember we heard on the radio that there was a coup d'etat. And remember, her father is a minister. And so she was very concerned. And then the next day, when we came home from classes for lunchtime, they had a number of people in our dorm. We would go back to the dorms and have lunch there if you were a boarder. And a number of the girls were crying when we got back to the dorm. And Bindu's older sister, who had gone to that school as well, was there. And I remember her saying, she was crying. She said, "Where's Bindu?" And I said, "Oh, Bindu's right behind me." You know, we weren't even thinking of any of this. And CBS aired the assassinations of all the ministers that were shot at gunpoint, including her father. So that reality right there made me think of what maybe I could do, because I was facing the scenario where my best friend, whose father had been a minister, had been an honorable minister who had been trained in the US. He had gone to Lincoln undergrad. I think he went to Georgetown Law School, and he was assassinated. And before our very eyes, I was 17. And that kind of informed my journey at the first part of my career as an international lawyer. Because the firm that I worked for, that senior partner who did international work knew her father.
Oh, wow.
And that firm had done work in Liberia. So I remember talking to Bindu, this is now fast forward 7 or 8 years. I'd gone through college and now gone through law school. I'm working for a firm, only to discover my senior partner knew her father. And we had done work for Liberia when he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, because it was the Minister of Foreign Affairs who would hire the lobbyists.
Right.
So it was such a small world. And so for the first 12 years of my practice, I did international work. I stayed away from litigation, even though, as I said, my law school professor said, you know, you have the instincts of a trial lawyer. And I was like, I think I have the instincts of an advocate. You know how coming from law school, you want to say what you think you are. And of course, lo and behold, after 12 years of doing international work, I transitioned and worked for Willie Gary, who was to me one of the most stellar trial lawyers of all times. And I had the pleasure of working with him, becoming a law partner there, working there for about 14 or 15 years in Florida. And then I transitioned to work here in Atlanta. I was a partner in a firm in Atlanta, and then I ended up opening up my own firm 2 years ago. And I still try cases with Willie Gary. I mean, he's just a phenomenal trial lawyer. So I cut my teeth as a trial lawyer in working with the greatest. And I feel that I cut my teeth as an international lawyer in working with some of the greatest lawyers that did international work. And that's where I met Reverend Jesse Jackson in 1988 as that lawyer in that big firm. And so the rest kind of is history in terms of my background. That's a long story.
Well, you answered several of my questions, but I did see Ashley Upkins was in here at one point. That's one of the YLD board members. I also see board member Keela Crane. But we did have a question about your international background. It's from Priscilla Bonsu, and she's actually going to be helping us with our international mentorship and pipeline programs and with our international students and YLD members. She says she was wondering what your advice would be for all of the international students and young international attorneys who have been struggling due to the current administration. Yes.
Well, first of all, my heart goes out to you. My heart goes out to you because of your struggle. The current administration, there's just not anything I can say about that you don't already know. But what I would say to you, some optimism, is most of you speak a second language. You do, because you come from a foreign country. And that second, and in some cases, third and fourth languages, that is what is going to distinguish you as a lawyer. That is an incredible asset. We have a global economy. And no matter what happens on the administration level, I'm putting into existence that Biden and Harris are going to win. I'm putting that into existence. I'm claiming that victory. But we have to look at the reality of the international students today. who are facing situations where some of them, with the campuses closing, may not have a place to go or to live.
Right.
And that is devastating. I do know that there are resources available at different schools to help those international students. In some schools, like I know Howard University, I believe GW, where past President Alfreda Robinson is, they made accommodations for the international students, understanding they couldn't travel, or if they traveled, they may not be able to get back into the US.
Right, right.
And so many of them had no option but to stay in the US, some of them really almost homeless. So if you find yourself in that situation, my recommendation would be, and I'm sure you've already done this, at the law schools that you are at, go into the offices. They should have an Office of International Affairs, BALSA. When I was in law school, BALSA was a very, very important and significant force for our international students. The NBA is probably going to be your best ally. Why do I say that? Because the NBA has robust programs with international students. We have, every time we did an international trip, we developed relationships in those countries. We have, as part of our NBA, on the board representation, I think the Botswana Bar and the South African Bar are actually represented on our board. We do not take lightly the plight of our international students. And I would encourage you all to go to the, not just YLD, but YLD and the cross-section between YLD and the international bar, or the international section that we have. I would start with that, firstly. Secondly, let's see what kinds of programs we can establish to YLD to raise money for international students. You've heard my international background. I have most of my career been an international student in a foreign country. I was not in the United States. I was the international student. Mm-hmm. So I have some particular insight. There probably are programs and monies available for the transition. I would say, look at your language skills, market your language skills. Right now, there are firms that do international work, and they have to hire translators and interpreters, and they have some lawyers that speak other languages. But if you speak those languages, identify those firms that do international work. That makes you an asset. I will tell you that the way, when I was in my first year, I traveled to Antigua, I traveled to Gabon, I traveled to, and then within a couple years, Angola. And the reason for that was because of my international background. Because we all know, we don't have to think far about how some of our classmates are narrow-minded. They don't have an international background. They don't understand when a client comes in, when you represent, for instance, a foreign government, there are firms that represent foreign governments, like in DC, and that's what I did. I lobbied on behalf of these entities. Well, if a minister from a French-speaking country came to the US and it was our client, guess what? I was always going to be on the case, because I was the only French speaker in the firm. And I was like really blah, blah, blah at that point in my career. And if it was an African country, I had traveled throughout Africa before going to law school. So I was already had a head up on, if you will, a leg up on the other lawyers, because I had a language skill. And it's not just a language skill. It's a cultural identification. It's the ability to communicate with people from different countries. Remember, there's so many Americans who are xenophobic, who are, they have fear for the unknown. Well, you as a lawyer, as a foreign student, you don't have fear for the unknown because you know what it is. So then you can relate, and so much of what we do in interacting with clients is based on relationships. I can tell you, when I travel everywhere, even as a practitioner around the world, many, many years, I would always look for people who I could identify with. When it comes to business, if I'm looking to find a lawyer, if I want to find a lawyer, if there's a lawyer who's a French speaker, a Spanish speaker, who's from another country, I'm looking for that. There are many people who look for that. And in fact, the way that the firm that I was with got involved in representing these foreign governments was because we used to lobby. And when they would go to Congressional Black Caucus members' offices, They would say, where are your Black lobbyists? We're in DC. Where are your Black lawyers? And don't bring Black lawyers who you just hired for that sole purpose. We want to see partners. We want to see significant lawyers. We want to see, and so that was actually how, when we were, the late Mickey Leland, who was a congressman out of Texas, he died tragically in a plane crash. Mickey Leland was instrumental in the firm that I was at, getting the government of Angola that was not officially recognized by the US government. So it had to be through the UN offices, because the US government in the 90s did not recognize the Angolan government because we were at the height of the Cold War. And the Angolan government had been supported by the Soviet government, and there were Cuban soldiers there. And so we were in the middle of the Cold War. And that was like, I don't know, taboo. So, but they needed representation in the US. So it was through the US, they didn't have an embassy. It was through the United Nations, their representative at the United Nations. And when people went to lobby, so they hired lobbyists, to Mickey Leland and other members of the Congressional Black Caucus, they were like, nah, look, we need some more diversity. And that's how, even though we were at a huge majority firm, that is how I began working with the government of Angola. And I did that for 3 or 4 years, the government of Gabon, 4 or 5 years. But in the process, you meet people. So if you're an international student, use those skills. Go back to basics. Understand that your language skills, your cultural difference is an asset. Pivot the conversation. Make it an asset. Join the international bars. There was the International Bar in DC. Every jurisdiction has them. Join those organizations as well. Become active as students when it's free in these bar organizations. Because it's free. We know you don't have money. Nobody had money. There's nothing to do about that. So, in DC, we used to eat, if you will, at receptions. We would go from reception to free reception. That was how we had all of our meals. And in the process, we networked. When you're hungry, you will find a way. So for those international students, don't despair. I've given you sort of 3 avenues. 1, through the international bar organizations. 2, do research when you're looking at firms that do international work. 3, look at the National Bar Association, and we've got a magnificent YLD chair. You also have a new chair of the law students. Let's work to see how we can help you all there. But there are many people that would extend. There actually are many NBA members who have a rich international history. And so you have to find those people and identify them. The way you do it is by start with the international section. Find out more, see what they're doing. I would task them with, we need to help our international students. But to help the students, you got to be a member. We know it's free, so you just have to join. I mean, we're not asking you to come out of your pocket. Everything is virtual. You don't even have to travel. Right. You have to be a member and be willing and hungry.
Yes. So Priscilla, we actually had planned on doing a panel of some sort for the international students and the issues that they were dealing with COVID, but it sounds like we need to do some additional follow-up. So I'll follow up with you about that, Priscilla. We have 2 more questions. I see Chair Bridges from the Women's Lawyers Division, and I would be remiss to not mention that today is Black Women's Equal Pay Day.
Yay! Yes.
I want for you to speak about that. And then we also have a question from Ashley Lee. She is serving as our election protection co-chair, our election protection sub-co-chair, and she's out of Atlanta. And she has a question about the 3 pandemics.
Absolutely.
Black lawyers, given the 3 pandemics that you speak about, what skills outside of competency should Black lawyers have or develop to adequately move the MBA and the overall legal profession? So if you could talk to Black Women's Equity Day and then the skills we need to tackle the 3 pandemics.
Okay, well, thank you. Black Women's Equity Day, this is a day that we must celebrate. We know that we are way behind. I was way behind when I started in practice, and we are way behind today. I can say in the course of my journey, I worked 20 times harder, not twice as hard. You know how we hear you have to work 20 times harder. And I had to fight for every client, for recognition and everything. And I ended up running circles around my colleagues. But yet, when it came to bonus structures, I noticed that the men across the board, the white women across the board, definitely the white men were at the top, white men, white women, black men, and then some, maybe Asian, every Latino, everybody else, and then it came to us. That's particularly disheartening if you generate a lot of business like I did.
Right.
So what we have to do, first of all, we have to recognize that there's that gap, there's that pay gap. And if you are in the workplace, there are many questions that you must ask. Part of my practice is employment discrimination. I've handled many cases. And when you are negotiating for a job, and I recognize that jobs are a little scarce right now, but it's not always going to be that way. But when you're negotiating for a job, you need to do your homework. If you are working for a government facility or in any type of state, federal, local government, that information is going to be a matter of public record. So when you're negotiating your deal, make sure you negotiate consistent with what the men are getting. That's number one. Understand the terms. Be bold enough, in a nice way, because you're trying to get the job after all, to ask the questions. To ask the questions. Because it is completely unacceptable for this gap to remain with Black women. Why should it take us, almost a year to get to where white men are and others? So we have to be vigilant as female lawyers, as Black women, vigilant and asking the questions, being prepared, knowing, I hate to say knowing your rights, but know your rights. If you are going into the door and you're starting a job and first year associates make $90,000 for $5, if it's $90,000, you need to make $90,000. All of you, Black, white, women, male. If it's $5,000, that's what everybody needs to make. But there doesn't need to be that, and we could start off with that dialogue, because employers have a duty to respond to those questions, and it's not being a troublemaker. And if you do your homework beforehand, you can get answers to those questions. If you see anyone when you're doing your due diligence on the law firm, if you're applying, you see someone who you think, like there's another African-American woman, you may want to reach out to that person and ask questions. Find out if you know anyone in the MBA who knows somebody there. We know everybody because we are everywhere. So find out, if you can get as much intelligence as possible. If it's a firm that does employment discrimination, well, we've got an employment section. We know all the people. We are those people, frankly. Right. So just being resourceful, doing your homework, and asking for the same as men get. Find out what the pay scale is. Find out what the bonus structure is. That's another way there's discrimination. Now, if you get in and you're not generating business, which I would encourage you all not to do, but if you are in a place where you don't generate business and they tell you, oh, you don't have to generate business, you just have to work. Don't go for that okie doke. You need to always be in a position to be thinking about how you generate clients in the private sector. It is misleading and just not something that I would encourage you all to follow, to think that you could be at a big law firm, be paid big money, and at some point for the discussion not to pivot to, okay, well, how many clients do you have? Right. And then you're going to say, well, I thought I had to do a service. No, because a dime a dozen lawyers that can service clients, that can write well, that can go in court and speak are a dime a dozen. So you must distinguish yourself, because it's so funny how money talks. When they start cutting people, they may not cut people who have business because money talks. So I don't know if I've answered that question adequately in terms of the things that, in terms of the gender gap, the pay equity, just being resourceful, make sure that you cross every T and dot every I, and know that you're entitled to get paid the same as your male counterpart.
Yes. And participate in YLD is having a social media campaign today, hashtag Black Women Equal Pay, and hashtag MBA YLD 2020 and beyond. We will be reposting for the rest of the night.
Absolutely. Absolutely, positively. Absolutely. I think that was the first question. The second question
was about the 3 pandemics.
Yes.
What can we do to help? What skills do we need? And I know you are particularly interested in encouraging YLD and the law students to help. So what can we do to help you battle these pandemics?
Well, let me just quickly review the 3 pandemics that are the focus of my administration. There's COVID-19. Well, that's the obvious pandemic that is disproportionately impacting our community, our membership, our loved ones. I'm in sitting here in Atlanta, Georgia, where and I practice in Florida, and the two top states, I think Georgia's number one and Florida's number two in terms of the number of people that have died and that are infected with COVID. I feel like every day of my life, I'm running from COVID. With my children, I'm running from COVID. I'm trying to teach them to run from COVID. I pay all this money for them to be at this very, very wonderfully whatever private school, and they're going to be sitting in their rooms learning virtually. Right. Because I can't run the risk. It is killing people every day. And now it's people that we know. It's no longer, your grandmother's best friend's sisters, next door neighbors, ex-husband's friend, uncle who has COVID. Now it's like in my case, my aunt, uncle, and cousin who live in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They're alive and we thank those blessings, but it's very, very personal now. So COVID-19, that is the first pandemic. The second pandemic is police brutality. Forever, Black people have been victims of police brutality. This is nothing new. What we are seeing now is the awakening. Some people are now woke. That's what y'all young folks call it, woke. Are woke to the reality that they're seeing, and actually, because there have been other films of, Black men and Black women being killed at the hands of the police. But George Floyd was just so in your face that it awakened. It did something magnificent in this country, which is caused a convergence, that rainbow coalition of Black and white and Latino and Asian and Native American and all different backgrounds and cultures, young people in particular, marching and protesting and saying Black Lives Matter. Yeah. Okay, so that's the second pandemic. The third pandemic is election suppression. For you young folks, it's hard to realize that people actually died so that we could have the right to vote. Literally died. Were lynched, were beaten, were raped, were killed so that we could have the right to vote. So we, as lawyers, as African-American lawyers, as lawyers of African descent, must protect the right to vote. Yeah. So those are the three pandemics. What can you all do as young lawyers? You might be saying, well, I don't even know what election suppression is. Election suppression is when there's an orchestrated effort to prevent people from voting, and they're usually Black and brown people. Let me give you an example. Here in Georgia, we had the primaries. We had brand new machines because after Stacey Abrams, after she lost or the election was stolen from her, then the state of Georgia said, well, we're going to buy these new machines and spend all this taxpayer money so that the next round of elections will be seamless. Right. Okay. So what we thought, congregating at the polls, we thought it was going to be seamless. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I wouldn't be able to speak truth to power on this. The brand new machines weren't working at my polling station 2 minutes away from my house. And I got there early because I had a radio show I was doing at 8 o'clock. So I said, the polling station opened at 7. Let me get there at 10, quarter to 7. I'll wait in line. And I was probably person number 25, 30, because the other people had the same idea I had. We're going to go and vote right quick and be done. Almost 5 hours later, I'm voting. Wow. The brand new machines weren't working. So then the question is, well, let's vote by paper ballots. They had 24 paper ballots, as in 2-4, less than 30, for hundreds of people who were waiting in line. So they had to send someone this is like a ghetto situation as far as I could see, send someone to the clerk's office to pick up the hard copies of ballots so people could vote. There was no water, there were no provisions. We were in COVID. We had to stand, it was the unthinkable. We did stand more than 6 feet apart. Everyone that I saw had on masks. I had on masks, I had on gloves, I had on a protective shield, like this plastic thing. I had on a Gilligan's Island hat. I had on a sweatsuit in 90-degree weather, but I was not going to be deterred because that was election suppression at its height. So getting back to your question, what do young folks do? Kind of what I did. I called the press. I escalated up and called the press. I called our election protection lawyers. Election protection is a movement, if you will, that was started by Barbara Arnwine, one of our stellar members of the National Bar Association. Yes. She is also She and Tanya Clayhouse are my senior consultants for our election protection effort. They have been since I chaired it last year. Election protection is where lawyers are trained, and non-lawyers too. And on election day, this is what it was traditionally before COVID, they would go into the polls, be there to ensure the integrity of the process. What does that mean? When people would turn Black and brown voters or Democrats away and say, oh, well, your signature, I have a card, your signature doesn't quite match up with this.
That has happened to me before in Florida.
Florida is famous for that. I did election protection in Florida from scratch.
That has happened to me.
But the signature doesn't quite match up. It says here that this is not your address. You're at the wrong polling station. Translated, you look too Black, we don't want to count your vote. That's how I look at it. Forgive me for being blunt, but these are young lawyers. I want you all to understand what we're up against. And so they would turn people away or allow you to vote and put your votes in a provisional category. Provisional ballots, you may have heard that expression. So you may wonder, how are those?
They did to my ballot.
That's in your ballot. So the question is, how are those provisional ballots counted? And when are they counted? When you might hear the results of the race maybe 3 or 4 hours after you voted, and you're wondering, where did my ballot go? Well, this is how it works. A group of people who are from the election, usually the Secretary of State, each locality handles it differently. But from the election, people who manage the election, volunteers that are handpicked by people in the locality. Many times in Florida, they were Republicans. They would sit in a room, like a conference room in the back of the Department of Elections in the locality, and they would look at the ballots and they would make a determination of which ones were valid. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Right.
So now again, where is election suppression there? If we hadn't been there, and if you don't have lawyers there, looking at the process, observing and pointing out inconsistencies, discrepancies, and elevating up to litigation, that's what election protection is.
Right.
They could just decide, oh, we don't have time to look at these, let's just not even count any of these. And then that's how their ballots that aren't counted. Florida, Anika, as you know, is the original find a group of ballots in the middle of the highway jurisdiction. Thousands of ballots in the middle of the highway.
Yes.
In some street in some remote place. That can only happen when someone who is supposed to transport those ballots of those people who voted, exercised their proper right to vote, just threw them in the trash somewhere, threw them in the highway. That's how that happens. That's election suppression, suppressing someone's right to vote. Another thing, the disinformation campaigns. Trust me, mark my word. In communities, all of a sudden there's going to be all this information that will misrepresent election day.
Right.
Usually the day after. We saw that happen in the last elections. So people are thinking they're getting information because not everybody has access to the internet. Not everyone is highly educated. Not everyone really understands the process. So when they read someplace or they're told because of information or there's a flyer that they see that election day is on, November 9th and it was actually November 4th, they're not going to vote November 4th because they may not be paying attention. They may not be paying attention to what's on television, you see.
Right.
And a lot of people are skeptical of what they see on television. That's election suppression. There's so many forms. So what is the role of lawyers? The role of lawyers is to protect the right to vote. And as I was saying, before COVID and even during COVID, people were in the polling stations observing the whole process. Post-COVID, now we know that one of the viable ways of voting is paper ballots and also absentee ballots. Well, in Black and brown communities, the absentee ballot and the paper ballot issue doesn't really work well. Why? Because in some states, you might have to answer 20 questions.
Right.
Lawyers don't answer 20 questions properly. So if you think about people, I'm just saying, if you're busy, you go, they answer, you're like, whatever, I'll skip that one, we'll go. And then you put it in the envelope, you send it in. That's what we do.
Right.
Well, in some jurisdictions, if all 20 questions aren't answered and they must see a clear check mark or clearly, then your ballot may not count.
Right.
Or how about, as we saw happen here in Georgia, you don't get your absentee ballot.
Yes.
That's why there were a lot of people at the precinct I was at, they were there because they were waiting for their absentee ballot. And now we know what's going to happen because our president has announced that he doesn't feel like funding the Postal Service.
Right.
Young lawyers understand what that means. That means that those people who don't want to be exposed to COVID, who don't want to take the risk, who don't want to stand in line, who are relying on voting by mail, those senior citizens who vote religiously and who are relying on voting by mail may not get their ballots because the funding to the funding, we don't like the Postal Service, the funding, that's playing with the right to vote. So what does that mean? How do lawyers come in? We have to, and there's litigation surrounding the extension of early voting. Why is early voting important? Because it's safer. When you're standing in a line, annoyed, and all this kind of stuff like we saw in Atlanta, we know that's gonna happen in November.
Yes.
If early voting is, say, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, if it's extended, more people will vote in early voting. African Americans, Latinos, immigrant communities typically vote heavily in early voting. And COVID especially, because they don't trust the system. They know they're not going to get their absentee ballot. I didn't get mine. They know they're not going to get, and so they don't trust that. So early voting is important. If you reduce the time of early voting versus expanding the time, then people get more nervous. That's a way of election suppression. Now, in certain zip codes, which could include my zip code, people don't have a problem with their absentee ballots at all. They don't have a problem voting for 10 minutes at all. 10 minutes away from my voting station, where I am, Brookhaven, it's like a mixed bag. You have very, very high income, and then you have a very significant Latino population and immigrant population. It starts in Brookhaven. There's a street called Buford Highway. Some people call that, I don't, but some people call it Immigrant Row, because there are numbers of people who from immigrant communities that live on Buford Highway. So when you have a Brookhaven, which has a mixture of a blend, someone like Stacey Abrams is going to take that. So that's a precinct where maybe the resources and all of that don't get to. Or you have brand new machines and no one's trained on them. But 10 minutes away, and actually Brookhaven and Buckhead used to be all the same community. 2 minutes away at another precinct in Buckhead that doesn't have the same demographic, it might take 5 to 10 minutes to vote. That's election suppression. So what the lawyers, young lawyers can do is get trained on election suppression. YLD has programs, election protection for the National Bar has programs. Wiley Branton Symposium, which is our conference in October, will have programs.
She was here, yes.
And she's here, and I want her to talk about that. But between now and then, there are training programs in many of our affiliate chapters and many of our jurisdictions where you see election protection training. You need to do that because there's a whole effort and resources. We have coalition partners galore that are working with us that need young lawyers. There's litigation that is instituted. You might say, well, I don't even know anything about litigation, but I want to help. Well, we would team you up with a group of lawyers who are doing this. This is all pro bono. Nobody's getting paid for this. It's all pro bono because people are vested in the right to vote. So that's where we are in terms of election protection. And Ms. Crane, I want her to say a few words because she's phenomenal. She's phenomenal. And she's making it happen in October at Wiley Branton. And again, another example of a young lawyer who came up through YLD, rocking and rolling, moving and grooving, civil rights, human rights, everything, past chair, phenomenal. And when I see you all in this capacity, I know the National Bar is going to go on forever. And the bar will be raised because you all are dynamic on it. And this is what I'm talking about. So, okay, I just had to say that. So,
Crane?
Yes, I am honored. Thank you so much for those very kind words, President Hoffler. Good evening, Chair Williams, and to all of my fellow YLDers and our friends as well. We are so excited to be rocking and rolling for the Wiley Branton Symposium this year. And we hope that all of you on the line will register as soon as registration opens very soon. Please mark the date, save the date, October 16th and 17th. We are excited to have a phenomenal program. We are going to be concentrating on one of President Hoffler's main focuses, which is election suppression. And we are going to be training young lawyers and all lawyers, quite honestly, on Saturday to learn how to do election protection. We are working with our friends at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law to do not just a broad sweep training, but state-specific training so that you know how to impact election protection in your state or a state that you may want to go to, or a state that you is near and dear to your heart. Of course, in October, we're still going to be under COVID. And so unfortunately, we're not going to be in person. Everything is going to be virtual, but that just means that so many more of our young lawyers will be able to participate in this awesome program. And so on Friday, we will begin, Thursday, I believe, that we'll be beginning with the Board of Governors meeting as we traditionally do. On Friday afternoon, we'll begin with programming starting about how can you run for office, because not only do we need to be protecting the vote, we need to have young lawyers participating as elected officials. So we'll be talking about that, and we'll have programming all the way down. We also, because President Hoffler is such an advocate for our young lawyers, we'll be having specific CLEs about how can young lawyers be a part of the civil rights effort today. And so we'll have programming around that, which will also feature another young lawyer as well on that panel that is produced by our general counsel, David Green. And so we'll have programming all day on Friday. Then again on Saturday is going to be concentrated on election protection. So if you're kind of anxious that I don't know how to do election protection or I've never done it before, don't worry about that. We will be having comprehensive training for you, a 2-hour training. It sounds like a lot, but it's not, because it's so interactive and involved that it just goes by very quickly. So there will be more to come on that. As soon as we have registration open, we will certainly give that to Chair Williams so that she can disseminate it for you. But we're so excited. We wish that you could be with us here in Detroit. Detroit is where President Hoffler was going to have it if we could be in person, but unfortunately it's not. But all of us here in the Detroit metro area are excited about Wiley Branton, and we hope that you will participate. Thank you so much, President Hoffler, for allowing me to serve in this position.
Oh, I am just tickled to death. I'm so honored that you are serving and that you're doing all that you do, and you're so talented. So talented. So I'm just so delighted. Let me just say one more thing. Why did we pick Detroit, Michigan? Well, originally pre-COVID, we wanted to have Wiley Branton at in a battleground state. Mm-hmm. So we knew that Michigan was at the top of the list. Michigan is critically important. But why Detroit? Well, because we have one of the strongest presence of African-American lawyers in the Detroit metropolitan area. One of the largest. There are multiple African-American bars, and there's a strong, robust affiliate chapter. We've got 3, perhaps more, but 3 past presidents from Detroit. Harold Pope, Reggie Turner, who's going to be the ABA president. Oh, we're so excited. And Dennis Archer. We have judges, incredible judges, Denise Langford Morris, Craig Strong, and so many others, very active NBA members. Both of them past chairs of the NBA Judicial Council, very engaged. We have in Michigan, in Detroit, poised and positioned in the voter, I don't want to say the voter, but the people who are responsible for elections in Michigan, dynamic African-American lawyers leading the way. There was no other place for us to go from my standpoint. So virtual or no virtual or some virtual, we are going to make history at Wiley Branton, and we want you to participate. We are adding something that we feel is so wonderful. And for young lawyers, whenever you see judges, you must bow down to them and respect them and give them so much homage. And when you are on panels, what we're doing at Wiley Branton, for all the panels, the substantive panels, we want the perspective of the judges. We call it a view from the bench. Why is that important? I can tell you as a trial lawyer, I think sometimes when I'm doing panels, I'm rocking and rolling, moving and grooving. A judge will get on there and say, you are rocking, rolling, moving and grooving, but that thing, that doesn't work in my courtroom. And let me tell you why. So when we have the most talented judges on the universe that are part of our organization, that you have access to by going to our conventions, even virtual conventions, you must use these tools and access them. You never know when you need a clerkship. For those of you who are in law school, my goodness, you must beg. You must beg for a job. We have every judge and every capacity known to mankind, all the courts everywhere, beg for a job. Must not be too proud to beg. I know that's how I got every job. I was begging, and I just knew I was going to work harder than everyone else. So when I was begging, I said, just let me get in the door.
Yes.
I mean, I was running, sir. We used to just pull all-nighters 2-3 times a week because I knew one thing. If they were going to fire someone, my Black self was going to be one of the first people to get fired. So I knew that if I worked harder than everybody else and I billed longer than everybody else, more hours, from an economic standpoint, they wouldn't fire me. Well, that was back in the day in the 80s. That's what we did. So when it comes to the election protection, you have here a living example of a tremendous YLD past chair.
Yeah. I would also, we are over time, but if we have.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Keela is, past chair Crane is actually our national census chair for our sorority. And so, as you know, last week, the U.S. Census Bureau changed the end date for the counts. And so that is something that YLD would love to help with. It's one of our focal points as well. And so if you both could just talk to how you think the young lawyers can help, we only have until September 30th to make sure our communities are counted, and we are all in hard to count communities.
Well, what we need to do, young lawyers, part of the effort is getting on the phone and calling and trying to encourage people. If you go to, even on a virtual platform, if you're in churches, if you're in organizations, if you're in sororities, if you're in fraternities, any social justice group that you're in, please encourage people to participate in the census. It's vitally important. There's so many things are tied to the census of rights and privileges that we can get in our communities. It's really important. Many people downplay it because either they don't know or they don't want us to be counted. They don't want privileges. They don't want money in our community. Right. So please participate. Reach out. You have a grandmother, great grandmother. I call them mama and them in my family, mama and them. Mm-hmm. Call mama and them and tell them to fill out. They may not have access to the internet, but you do. Help them with it. Help them with it. Help them fill out the paper stuff. There are many ways that we can do this. And that's how you can help us young lawyers. But I think I should ask Madam Past Chair to address that as well.
Keila, if you'd like.
Madam President, you said, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to say we mentioned and we've dropped the link. This Saturday, we will be talking about, led by Past Chair Crane. She will be moderating and President Hoffler will be a panelist. We will be talking about voting rights and the 2020 census redistricting. So Keila, you want to end us on a high note?
Listen, I can't do any better than the president. What do you mean? What am I supposed to be doing?
You are the one hosting the event on Saturday. You're the National Census Chair. You're past chair. You got to give us our charge. Tell us what to do.
This is about President Hoffler, so I'm going to do it this way. We have a dynamic leader, a Young Lawyers Division, in President Hoffler and Chair Williams. You heard the charge from our president about the 3 pandemics. Figure out where in these 3 pandemics that you can lend your voice, your talent, your skills, and we have so much work to do. The president has an ambitious schedule or ambitious plan for this year, and there's no room for anybody to be sitting on the sidelines. So whatever it is, whether it is the COVID task force, whether it is election suppression, whether it's police brutality or something else, you have room to get engaged. So contact President Hoffler's team to be a part of the transformative, innovative leadership that President Hoffler is going to give to us this year.
Thank you. And President Hoffler, please, whatever remarks you would have us do, and any last charges?
Last charge, I'm charging you young lawyers to get involved. This is not the time to let someone else do it. Right. You must do it. You must take leadership. And I must leave you with my favorite expression. A luta continua. Vittoria es cerca. The struggle continues and victory is certain. That struggle part, you've got to kneel to justice, but stand up to fight. And in each of those pandemics, we must fight as Black lawyers and be on the front line. There's so many ways that you can do that. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And I just,
Thank you. Thank you.
if we were here in person, we'd be hugging. And then we'd go out and take care of business.
Thank you so much for coming to speak to YLD. We hope everyone was able to learn something new about our new president. I hope you take the charge that we've been given seriously when we ask for volunteers, when we ask for program ideas. I'm asking you to please participate. We are being counted on, not just by our communities, but President Hoffler has specifically asked us to help, and that is what we intend on doing. So thank you so much for coming out. I hope you enjoyed it. Look forward to future events like this where we will meet other Board of Governors members. And please let us know if you have any suggestions, any program suggestions, please reach out and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Night.